Samuel Egerton Brydges was this bibliographer. He was a poet, a politician, and eventually he decided to try his hand at writing novels. In 1798, he wrote this novel, Arthur Fitz-Albini, that promised to cause quite a stir. See, it was an autobiographical novel, which meant not only was the main character based on him and his life, but all of the supporting characters were based on real people that he knew. People he liked, people he didn't like. And he promised to reveal all manner of sordid secrets about these people. So you can imagine, given this opportunity to maybe recognize someone among the characters in this book, it was moderately popular. And among its eager customers was one George Austen, rector of Steventon Parish and father of our beloved Jane. Now, we know Jane to be a woman of morals, so I'm happy to tell you that she did not support the purchase of this book. She did not want to give any money to someone who would write such a thing. In a November letter to her sister, she writes, "My father has bought it against my private wishes, for it does not quite satisfy my feelings that we should purchase the only one of Egerton's works of which his family are ashamed." However, the damage was done, and a copy of the book was now in her possession. So she goes on to say that these scruples do not at all interfere with my reading it, you will easily believe. This is the Jane Austen podcast. I'm your host, Becky, and today is a very big day. Welcome. I am so glad you are here. After many months of preparation, research, reading, learning so many things about how to create a podcast, I am finally sitting down in front of a microphone to actually record an episode, which is just so exciting. I am thrilled to be able to share my love of Jane Austen with all of you. I was first introduced to Jane Austen's work long ago in the 7th grade. I don't know if you're familiar with the accelerated reading program, if that was something you were subjected to in school, but basically it was part of our English grade. Every book was given a certain number of points. It was a way to measure how much we were reading on our own. You would read a book and then you would take a test and you would get a certain number of points based on how long the book was, how difficult it was, and how well you did on the test. I loved to read back in those days, but I wasn't super into doing schoolwork. So I found myself at the end of the semester with no AR points. So my brilliant idea was, hey, go big or go home. I'm just going to read the book that's worth the most points, and then that will cover all the points that I need for my English grade. But that book was Don Quixote, which was super long. So I went down the list and said, okay, well, what's the next book worth the most points? And it was Pride and Prejudice. How fortunate for me that it was Pride and Prejudice. I was a big procrastinator, so I remember sitting in my English classroom at the end of school, the very last day of the semester, long after everyone else had gone home. My English teacher said I had until she went home to take the test, so I was reading through the last few chapters. I think I had read the whole book in like 1 week because I had just waited until the end. And, I took the test, I got my points, I got my grade, but none of that matters now, 20 years later. The only thing that matters is that I loved the book. I loved it. And then a few years later, the 2005 movie with Keira Knightley came out, and so of course I had to read the book again before I could go see the movie. Fell in love with the movie. And over the next 10 years, I made my way through all 6 of Jane's novels. Like for many of you, I think, they ended up becoming books that just felt so comfortable. And they were the books that I went to when I was just needing something familiar. They were very influential during my formative years of my early 20s when I found myself dating and looking for a marriage partner and making decisions about friends. And these books had such an impact. I just love rereading them and watching the story unfold. And I have found that as I have reread them, I pick up things every time that I hadn't noticed before. My perspective changes as I get older. And so I've read them over and over again. And with each read, like I said, I understand a little bit better. And so that's what kind of sparked my desire to research a bit more about Jane Austen's life and the Regency period. I just thought if I know more about her, if I know more about that time, then there will be even more that I will get out of these books. And so that started a few years back where I really started looking into all of those things, and I just learned so many cool things that I decided I wanted to share them with all of you. And I'll just start by admitting that I've had all the rest of the episodes of this series planned out for months now, but I've really struggled with knowing where to start. I went back and forth quite a bit, but finally decided to start with the question of why. I think it's safe to say that every episode will be addressing why we love Jane Austen, but why do we even know about her? I collect antique novels. I love to find and read old books that look like they were well loved, even though I don't recognize the titles, and a lot of them are good, but we've never heard of them. It isn't enough to write a good story. There are other factors involved in determining whose work becomes a classic and whose fades into oblivion. So that's what I want to talk about today. What was it about Jane and her novels that have kept them relevant for the last 200 years? Why is it that she's such a big part of our culture? And by our culture, I'm speaking internationally. There are Jane Austen fans on every continent. She is popular globally, which is pretty awesome. I think a big part of her success is just good timing. Novels were really coming into popularity, into existence in the 18th century. That's kind of how we see when we pinpoint the birth of the modern novel. She was born in 1775, so she kind of hit this sweet spot where she was raised on these great early novels. But when she started writing, the art form was still new enough that she can be considered a pioneer of her craft. She did things in her novels that had never been done before. So she hits this little Goldilocks zone where she wasn't the first. She was able to learn from the mistakes and successes, I guess, of others, but she still got in at the ground floor. It was during her lifetime, and really right after her death, as we kind of moved into the Victorian era, that novels were becoming more mainstream. Humans are and have always been hesitant to accept something new, and this was certainly true of novels, just as much as it was true of smartphones. People did not take to them right away. It took a while. I mentioned Don Quixote earlier. It was published in 1605, and it's considered to be the first modern novel, but really the literary highlights of the 17th century are plays and epic poems. Don Quixote really stands out as the only prose fiction to make a name for itself during that era. Shakespeare was writing. We have Milton's Paradise Lost. Molière was making a name for himself with plays like Don Juan and The Misanthrope, but no one was really writing prose fiction. There just wasn't a market for it yet. You can imagine that if everyone is reading these great histories, biographies, ancient Greek philosophy, the idea of sitting down to read a made-up story probably seemed kind of silly. Of course, the plays that I just mentioned are also made-up stories, lighthearted comedies even, but it's a very different thing to go see a play than it is to read a book. Even when these plays were read in people's homes, which they were likely read aloud, acted out. It didn't really feel like the same thing. So then, in 1719, Daniel Defoe publishes Robinson Crusoe, and it actually does very well. Defoe was a journalist, among many other things. I don't want to minimize him, but this is not his podcast. But his journalism really had a big influence on his writing style. His novels were very detailed. He wrote as if he was like reporting on a story, and they were grounded in a familiar reality. Robinson Crusoe, the main character, sets sail from a real place. He goes to real places. So when he is shipwrecked on an island, it also feels real. And this hyper attention to detail is something that you can find in all of his novels. So when people read them, they didn't really feel like they were reading something made up. They felt like they were reading one of those histories or biographies that was so popular, and this started to turn the tide for novels as a medium. By the time Jane was born, Novels were still seen as a kind of lower form of entertainment, but they were becoming more popular, and her family were big fans. In a letter from 1798, she writes about this woman in the neighborhood who's going to start a library, Mrs. Martin. She came to the Austens and was asking if they would like to sign up, and Jane is writing to her sister. She says, she asked for my name as a subscriber to her library, which opens the 14th of January, and my name, or rather yours, is accordingly given. As an inducement to subscribe, Mrs. Martin tells us that her collection is not to consist only of novels, but of every kind of literature. She might have spared this pretension to our family, who are great novel readers, and not ashamed of being so. But it was necessary, I suppose, to the self-consequence of half her subscribers. So she's saying there, this woman is putting together this library, and she's saying, it's not just novels, don't worry, it's not just novels. But the Austens don't care, they like novels. In fact, in Northanger Abbey, she writes this monologue for the narrator in defense of novels. She was young. This was written in the late 1790s, so she's in her very early 20s. She's young. She's full of that fire of youth. She's ready to fight for the honor of novel readers everywhere. And she kind of uses the reading of novels as a character clue throughout her stories. Readers are the good guys. Those who look down on novels, we need to be wary of. In all of this novel reading that she was doing, she was clearly paying close attention to the elements that make a story work. I mentioned that story about Egerton Brydges in the beginning, not just because I think it's funny, but because he offers an interesting foil to Jane. As a side note, my favorite part of that story is that at the time Jane wrote the letter, her sister was obviously away from home, and her mother wasn't feeling well and kind of shut up in bed. So Jane and her father are spending their days mostly just the two of them, and this is what they chose to do together, read this gossipy book and see who they recognized among the characters. And Brydges was the brother of Jane's very dear friend, so they ran in the same circles. They certainly would have recognized someone. Anyway, Brydges was a bibliographer, as I said, so books were his livelihood and his passion. He was educated, very well read, and because he had read so much, he thought he would be a natural writer. He wasn't. Everything I read about him said that his books aren't really even worth mentioning, but his work as a bibliographer was very important. Jane says this too. In that same letter, she says, "We have neither of us yet finished the first volume. My father is disappointed. I am not, for I expected nothing better. There is very little story, and what there is told in a strange, unconnected way." Jane, on the other hand, was also very well read, and although she didn't get the prestigious education that Brydges did, her reading served her much better than his did. We're fortunate to have copies of Jane's Juvenilia, her first stories and writings from when she was young, when she was a teenager. And it's very clear as you read through them that she was not just reading, she was studying. Her ability at 13, 14 years old to not only grasp the essential elements of popular genres, but to parody them is incredible. I won't pretend her early stories are great. They're pretty rough at times, but she hits the mark spot on in her understanding. Two genres that she read a lot of that were very popular were Gothic novels and sentimental novels. Gothic novels, well, no surprise there. We still love them, right? Whether it's a book about vampires or a true crime show about a gruesome murder, we eat that up. And apparently we always have. And I know it's easy to look back on olden times and think that they were so pure and innocent, but these Gothic novels were anything but. They dealt with a range of things, from kidnapping and imprisonment to rape and murder. It was only the heroine, always a true damsel in distress, who was naive and full of virtue. Sort of overlapping with the Gothic was the sentimental novel. This was a genre full of feeling. The main character was usually someone really sympathetic, like an orphan, who has all of these intense challenges which they face with equally intense feeling, and by the end they're either rewarded for their sensibility or they die a tragic death, whatever will inspire the most feeling from the audience. And sensibility here does not mean having a good sense, it's closer to sensitivity. Google says it means the ability to appreciate and respond to complex and emotional or aesthetic influences, or a person's delicate sensitivity that makes them readily offended or shocked. Lots of fainting in these stories, lots of long-lost siblings, rich uncles, lovers, etc. Young women walking miles in the rain, anything to garner sympathy. And as ridiculous as these stories could be, they actually served to bring awareness to the poor and the needy in England at the time. Groups who were generally thought to be burdens or bad influences on society were painted in these stories as individuals who needed help, and audiences responded to that. And Jane loved these kinds of books. These were the kinds of books that she was raised on. So in her early work, she's very much playing with these genres that she's so familiar with. And her first completed novel that's actually sold to a publisher, Northanger Abbey, carries on this satire, although in a more mature and complete way than what we see in the juvenilia. But then a decade passes. Northanger Abbey never actually sees the light of day, so she's still completely unknown as an author. When in 1811, she publishes Sense and Sensibility. Obviously, with sensibility in the title, we know it's going to provide some commentary on the subject, but it's really a very different thing than audiences were familiar with. And followed by Pride and Prejudice soon after, she begins to establish this new style of novel. She was called, and rightly so, the novelist of home. While others were writing stories about haunted castles, great battles, epic voyages, Jane was writing about everyday life. There's an editorial note from her publisher at the end of her brother's biography that says, "Notwithstanding the temptation which nearly all writers are under to imitate that which has commanded distinguished success, Miss Austen at once freed herself from such influence, and, with combined boldness and modesty, struck into a path of her own, of which she remains to this day the undisputed mistress." That was written in 1833, but I would extend the "to this day" to now. It is still true. We can see the impact that her novels had on modern women's fiction that just takes place in everyday lives of women. My next quotation here is a long one, but bear with me. This is from a critical review of her work written in the late 1800s. The reviewer says of Jane's novel, "The work is all done by half a dozen people. No catastrophes or discoveries or surprises of a grand nature are allowed. Neither children nor fortunes are found or lost by accident. The mind is never taken off the level surface of life. The reader breakfasts, dines, walks, and gossips with the various worthies, till a process of transmutation takes place in him, and he absolutely fancies himself one of the company." The secret is, Miss Austen was a thorough mistress in the knowledge of human character, how it is acted upon by education and circumstance, and how, when once formed, it shows itself through every hour of every day, and in every speech of every person. Her conversations would be tiresome but for this, and her personages, the fellows to whom may be met in the streets, or drank tea with at a half-hour's notice, would excite no interest. But in Miss Austen's hands we see into their hearts and hopes, their motives, their struggles within themselves, and a sympathy is induced which, if extended to daily life and the world at large, would make the reader a more amiable person. And we must think it that reader's own fault who does not close her pages with more charity in his heart towards unpretending, if prosing worth, with a higher estimation of simple kindness and sincere goodwill, with a quickened sense of the duty of bearing and forbearing in domestic intercourse, and of the pleasure of adding to the little comforts even of persons who are neither wits nor beauties. It's interesting, my mom just finished reading Pride and Prejudice for the first time, and she said just this, that it made her want to be a better person, just like this critic experienced so long ago. Jane Austen wrote stories about people who felt real, doing activities that felt real, caught up in concerns that people really had. It didn't need to be dramatic. She saw the depth of the real human experience and captured it beautifully in her 6 novels. Because her stories were so different, she wasn't always taken seriously by other writers or by reviewers. Authors who were writing very important stories dismissed her work as trifling, but she has always been admired by readers. Another notable reviewer and great advocate for Jane's work was George Henry Lewes. He has a very long essay about her from 1859, in which he says, "Nothing that is really good can fail at last in securing its audience, and it is evident that Miss Austen's work must possess elements of indestructible excellence, since, although never popular, she survives writers who were very popular. She will doubtless be read as long as English novels find readers. And here we all are to attest to the truth of his words. There's so much more to be said about our dear Jane, but this is where we're going to end today. Next time we will be talking about Jane's childhood. You won't want to miss it. What gift did great-grandmother Austen leave for her descendants? Why didn't baby Jane live with her parents? And who was the woman with the wooden leg? For all of that and more, join me next time. Please hit subscribe so you'll be notified when episodes come out. Also, if you would like to join the conversation over on social media, you can search for me at Jane Austen Podcast on Instagram or look for the Jane Austen Podcast page on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening and have a lovely day.